going to go ahead and get started here with Carl, VP from Cadence, and also Krishna, CEO from Komprise. So, Krishna, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you so we can go ahead and get started.
Thank you again, all of you, for joining us. And thank you so much, Carl, for spending this time with us today. I know a lot of people in the audience are facing similar challenges with data growth and how to manage their data. And so the story of Cadence is fascinating. And also Cadence being a pioneer in the electronic design industry, and with so much getting designed today, from driverless cars to IoT to chips. I mean, there's chips everywhere today. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that journey and how Cadence is a part of that journey and how that ties into your data management challenges.
Sure, happy to do so, Krishna. Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you all for attending, and Monica, thank you for the very warm introduction. Once again, my name is Carl Siva, Vice President of Information Technology at Cadence. And Cadence designs software and hardware that companies use to design electronics. As electronics get more complex, the storage problem becomes greater than it was in prior years. As Krishna mentioned, we're entering new industries like automotive and IoT, which add even more data proliferation and explosion than we've seen. So to manage and control all these complexities, we had to seek a solution that helped us solve these problems. And with that said, I will discuss a few of the drivers that led us down this path. So the first one is we had to look to control cost and take the expense out of our primary storage and move it to a storage that was less expensive. In order to do this, we needed greater business intelligence and insights into our data. And so the solution that we looked at needed to not only be able to move data, but also tell us what data to move, which is a very complex problem to solve. Lastly, we didn't want to wait multiple years to realize the return on investment. So the solution also had to have a very short time to value, which means from the time that we purchased the solution to the time we begin to see benefits needed to be months and not years. So these three things were the most critical drivers for us as we went down this path. The challenges that we had specifically, again, as data exploded and was growing in multiples of our deployments, our budget stayed flat, and we had to make a choice on how to manage this. So the next key challenge was whatever we do needed to not disrupt the business. It needed to be able to get in place without me having to tell the business to take months or weeks of downtime.
I actually had a question on that, Carl. I know a lot of people today are looking at the cloud as an option, and one of the concerns with going to the cloud is it is a paradigm shift, because you have to go to an object paradigm, which many recognize is the path to the future, but it is a disruption. How did you reconcile that?
Yeah, so thanks, Trish. That's a great question. So thankfully, the software, particularly Komprise, did all the heavy lifting for us, and we had to know approximately zero about object-based storage. So it allowed us to go from a POSIX-based file system to an object-based file system really at the click of a button. So for us, it was more of a business decision versus a technology decision. And when you're outsourcing storage, whether it's internally outsourced or externally, you just want to find the best value. And for us, we felt that an object-based storage with an external provider was the best value.
Great. Yeah.
The last challenge that we had was we found that data was accessed infrequently after a period of time, and we wanted to have a way to take low-value data off of high-value storage and move it to low-value storage. The solutions really, as we saw it, were we had to establish a cloud target. There you see at the top. And this cloud target had to be less expensive than our primary storage. So this is the number one, probably most important thing to consider. The second one was the software had to be able to scan the data, and we had to assign it to look at multiple lines of business in our company to go across product lines and departments in order to find the best value or target to move to the cloud. So at a very high level, we looked at departments and products. We used the software to scan these departments and products, and then the software allowed us to compare the cost of storing it in primary versus moving it to the cloud, and this is how we decided to make the decisions to save money.
And I know the other interesting thing about your use case that I think other customers in other verticals also share this issue is a lot of times the data is not only spread across multiple shares and multiple file servers, it's also pretty voluminous, right? There's billions of files, thousands of shares. Some are very small, some are very large, so there is no clear pattern to all of this data.
Yes, yeah, Krishna, that's a great point. It's absolutely correct. So we were no exception to that rule. We have thousands and thousands of shares across many heterogeneous storage types, and Komprise allowed us to simply input a big list, and it went out and did the work, and we didn't worry about versions of file systems or what type of storage devices these were on. We simply were able to gain analytics back and make a decision at a macro level as opposed to going into the micro level. So that's a great point, and we're no exception. Most companies are like us. They're very heterogeneous, and data is spread across many areas. Yeah. So sort of in summary, Komprise addressed our challenges mainly in the following ways. We were able to point it at these thousands of shares, gain analytics, and then we were able to sort of migrate data from our primary storage to the cloud without overloading our primary storage, because keep in mind, business is still happening while these operations are in progress. So we were able to conduct normal business in parallel, moving files to the cloud. And if a file was in use, the software would simply wait until the file was released and would then move it to the cloud at its convenience. The setup time for the software was very simple and straightforward. Komprise has a staff full of experts who know their products extremely well, and we're able to deploy this in an agentless manner, which meant it was fast, it was simple, and it was effective. So this is a summary of the Cadence journey, and with that, I will hand it over to Krishna.
Thank you so much, Carl. Thank you for giving that overview. And what I wanted to do now is just because some of the folks in the audience may not be aware of who Komprise is, I wanted to just quickly tie into Carl's story and show you what Komprise does, and also, in that I can highlight how, Cadence used the solution. And as we go along, feel free to type in your questions in the chat window or the questions window, because we will be answering all the questions at the end, and we want this to be very interactive. So a little bit of background about Komprise. We're based in Silicon Valley, California. We're a venture-backed company. We have our product has been used by enterprise customers. It's an analytics-driven data management solution. It's been in production for about 2 years now. Currently, we're managing over 100 petabytes of data across our customers. Our customers tend to be from different data-intensive verticals, like engineering, design, and manufacturing, financial services, genomics and healthcare, and government and oil and gas. And Gartner recently chose us as a cool vendor because of our disruptive innovations in storage. And as Carl mentioned, what really got us to start Komprise, because this is the third startup for the core team at Komprise. This is our third business in the storage market. The reason we started Komprise is because customers told us that they were literally drowning in data. And much like Carl described, today we are at an interesting juncture in the market where pretty much electronic design is at the heart of everything, and it's touching every vertical you can think of. And as designs are getting more sophisticated and as the applications are getting more varied, it's all generating that much more data. And that data is pretty valuable, but not all that data is used all the time. So there is a better way to store and manage and extract value of that data without keeping it all exactly where it originated. And that's what we do. We analyze and show that, and then we help you move that data to where you want it based on its SLA as opposed to where it was put initially without disrupting users and applications. We analyze data usage across storage, and then we move and replicate data based on your policies, and we provide transparent access to that data without any changes for users or applications. And you might say, these ideas of managing data more efficiently are not entirely new. People have heard about this for a while. So why did we create Komprise? And Carl, I don't know if you can comment on that a bit here.
Yeah. So Krishna, if I may inject a statement. So this is really key because I've been in the industry for a while, and I've searched high and low for products that did this, and I've used similar products. I won't bring any names to the table, but all of them had their flaws. Some of them were inline, some of them used stubs, and the stubs were static and they were fragile. And we had many issues with metadata and various other challenges. So for a company like Cadence and for a technology professional such as myself, when I came across this product, I actually was in disbelief as to the claims until we tested it. And this is the first I've seen of its kind. Secondly, I think the point of being able to not only move but to copy data was a clear advantage for us as well. So I just wanted to kind of, bring some light onto this point that you made earlier.
That's great. Thank you, Carl. And so how do we do this? Because as Carl mentioned, Komprise is different because of the way it does things. It gives you analytics, it moves and manages data, but it does all of this without being invasive or intrusive. So it does it with no agents on the storage, no stub files, no changes to existing behavior, and no disruption to production usage. So let me talk a little bit about how Komprise works. So the way Komprise works is it runs simply as one or more virtual machines in your environment. So literally to set up Komprise takes only about 15 minutes. You download a virtual machine from us, you power it on in your environment, and literally point it at your storage. At this point, I'm going to actually switch and show you a demo of how that works. So essentially, when you set up Komprise, once you bring up the Komprise virtual machine, you literally just point it at any storage that you may have in your environment. So you can point. In this example, we have pointed Komprise at some of Isilon filers, some NetApp 8 mode, cluster mode filers, some NetApp 7 mode filers, Windows servers, etc. Literally, you just give the IP address of the filer, discover shares, Komprise finds all the shares on the filers, and you pick the ones you want to look at. As Carl mentioned earlier, when Cadence deployed Komprise, they went through the same process. And actually, we went from POC to production without changing the environment. We literally just added more virtual machines to go from POC to production. And that's because the POC setup was exactly the same. They brought up the observer and just pointed at their storage. Komprise found the shares. They picked the ones they wanted to look at. And once they do that, within minutes, Komprise actually shows you a profile of all that data. And even on petabytes of data, like in Cadence's case, and even when you have hundreds of millions of files, Komprise is able to very quickly give you analytics and then continue to analyze in the background because of the way it does things.
Yeah, and Krishna, just to add a point, so I think what's very important is that we found we were able to gain analytics very quickly. As the system was crawling, we were able to look at the data live and start to see the data compile. And again, in previous experience, it would take at least a month, before you would see any sort of actionable data. And we began to get actionable data within maybe a week or so, or maybe less. So I think this is an important differentiator.
Yeah, and the other thing was, I remember at first you pointed Komprise at some test shares, but quickly you gained confidence, and even in the POC, you were pointing it at production shares, and there was no SLA impact on those shares. Engineers did not complain, right? There was no issue.
Yeah, so while we would never have a good practice of pointing to production shares, Krishna, we did not experience any disruption, and we were very confident in the ability for the software to gain visibility. So yes.
And the way Komprise does that is it is adaptive. It backs off as it's running, so that if your shares are in use by other users, Komprise slows itself down. It's like a housekeeper of data. Just as you would never want your housekeeper to be cleaning while you're eating dinner, Komprise is running in the background.
Yes,
okay?
we found it to have a very good throttling mechanism.
That's exactly right. It is throttling back as needed for your network and your storage. So the first thing Komprise shows you is a view of all your data and a wheel of how old or how new your data is. And in most environments, what we find is 50% to 70 or 80% of data is typically over a year old, meaning that it hasn't been accessed in a year plus. And there is some new data coming in as well. In addition to that, you can also see how fast data is growing in your environment. So you can project, if you did nothing, how much additional storage capacity you would need. And the reason Komprise shows you not only data usage, but also data growth is because when we talk to customers told us that the two big issues they're having with managing data more efficiently is that even though they intuitively know that a lot of the data is cold, identifying what data is cold and what data is hot on a continual basis is really hard. And the second thing is capacity planning is very hard, because even though you roughly know how much extra you spent on storage in the last few years, you really don't know how much more you're going to need in the future. So people end up over provisioning because they just don't want to get it wrong. And with storage budgets staying flat, that over provisioning is hard to justify. And I don't know, Carl, if that was also a motivator for you.
Yeah, so with Komprise and the cloud, we have an option where we did it before. So we could evacuate less valuable storage within given time periods, depending on business priorities, whether or not we're able to get a shelf of storage in time or not. And I think this business agility is a key advantage to any company, where now you have an A-B switch, whereas before it was just an A switch and you didn't really have an option. So yes, absolutely, this was a factor for us as well.
And that helps you leverage OpEx and the fact that you could spin up and spin down things more easily in the cloud. It gives you a kind of elastic storage capacity.
Yeah, correct. Peak loads, engineering projects, these were all advantages for us. So yes, completely agree.
Yeah. So along with showing the data usage and growth, Komprise also shows you what kinds of data you have for each distribution by age, and all kinds of analytics on your data, like who's actually using the data, is it big files or small files? Because the other interesting thing is industries like EDA, there tend to be a lot of small files, but in most environments, in aggregate, they don't consume a lot of space. And so Komprise can actually manage those files differently than the larger files. Because that has always been an issue in industries like EDA with moving very small files.
Right, yes, agreed.
And it also shows you who's using the data, which groups, which users, etc. So different kinds of analytics on your data. But along with all these analytics, Komprise not only does analytics, it actually does the data movement and data replication. To see the benefit of that, you have a plan on the left-hand side that you can edit. And as Carl said, even before you move any data, you can project the savings you're likely to get in your own environment. So to do that, you can set up some policies on the left. So here we have 3 different policy groups for 3 kinds of data. Each policy group, you can set what shares it applies to and what the policies are. And you can set policies to move data based on certain criteria, and you can set your own targets, and also to copy or replicate data, because quite often in most environments you're keeping data on primary storage. You're often mirroring that on primary storage. That's doubling the cost. And then you're keeping some backup copies, which might be adding another 1 to 3x factor on it.
Yeah, that's right. This is an important thing to consider. So for data that you need to keep, but that you don't want to keep an expensive backup target, you can make a copy, keep it in a durable cloud provider, and have it kind of sit there and rely on the durability of the cloud provider. Again, these are great choices that you can make. I think one other important point is you can actually predict what you're going to do before you do it.
Yep.
And for any IT shop, this is very important because you can make sure that the decision you're making is sound before you go ahead and hit the big green button. So for us, the ability to know what we're going to do and how it affects our environment before we do it is very key.
And actually, you use some of that in your planning and budgeting decisions, I believe.
Yeah, we were able to actually reduce our overall CapEx budget forecast as a result of the savings that we're going to experience from Komprise. So that's a very important point.
Yeah, and to do what Carl mentioned in terms of seeing the projections, you literally can change your policies here, and as you change them, you will see the projections dynamically get updated. So for example, if we said, well, what if we move data less than 3 months old, you see that this change is updated, and now it's saying 68% of data would get moved out, and that would free so much capacity, reduce backup by so much, and here's the cost savings. And all the cost modeling behind this, you can actually edit and put in your own costs. So this can be customized to your needs. So once you set this up, and once you set all these policies up, you literally can just say you're done and you activate your plan. And when you activate the plan, Komprise actually starts moving data based on your policies and copying data. And when it moves and copies data, the way it does it is also pretty unique. And so what Komprise does is, unlike a lot of solutions that get into the data or the control path, they do one or the other. So usually they put an agent on the storage, or they have something on the network layer that's watching the traffic to see what data has been moved off, and then they respond to those requests. And that's not ideal because 95% of the time the request that the filer is getting is for hot data, and you don't want to be in the path of that. Control path or data path, it's invasive. So Komprise doesn't do that. Komprise sits behind your control and your data path, meaning that we're like the Maytag repair guy who's waiting for the phone to ring and the phone's just never ringing. That's sort of what's happening to us. 95% of the time, the filers are getting the request and they're responding because they have the data, and we're nowhere in the picture. We don't even know about it.
Yeah, so this is what I had referred to in my opening statement as out of band. So it's very important that this was out of band. It didn't interfere with the critical operations. In EDA, you have many random reads and writes, small, big files. And to put something in front of our filers would have to match or exceed the performance, so it was cost prohibitive. So it was very important that we had something that was passive, out of band, and in the background was able to still move data. Very important point. Yeah.
And so then you could say, well, okay, if you're not in the path of data, how do you help, and you don't put stub files, how do you know when cold data gets accessed? So just like the Maytag repair guy does pick up the phone when the phone rings, that's what we do, right? So when cold data is accessed, then Komprise gets that request and it returns a file mapping to the object that's sitting in the cloud. And the way we accomplish this is when we move data, this is showing you a Windows file server view. And in EDA, I should have put in also an NFS view. It's just it's not as sexy to see as a Windows filer, but a lot of EDA use cases are more NFS. The same works on the NFS side, where before and after look the same. You have a filer with files. This is a filer where after we moved files, the moved files still appear exactly as before, but when you click on this file, the file actually has a link, and it's not a static link. So traditional stub files point to the new location of the file, and the problem with that is if that stub is corrupted or deleted, your data is orphaned. Here, think of this like a DNS router. The stub file, the dynamic link is actually dynamically bound to the object. It's not bound at static design time. As a result, even if these links are deleted, they can be repopulated.
Right. And Krishna, I think that's an important point. Is there is intelligence in the background that keeps track of these links. Whereas you mentioned in the static traditional stub, it was very fragile, and if someone changed it, you wouldn't be able to go back and figure out what changed. So the fact that there's some kind of intelligence in the background keeping track of it was another sort of reason we were confident in the solution.
Yeah, and the way Komprise keeps that data also is not using a traditional database. It's not using a traditional database on the analytics, for the analytics data or for data movement. And the reason for that is we're actually preserving the option to have native access to the data in the cloud. So the other advantage is, as Carl mentioned, sometimes when you're moving or copying data to the cloud, you're not just using the cloud as a cheap storage tier. You also want to leverage the elasticity of the cloud. What if you want to run some new, maybe some EDA kind of automation runs in the cloud with burst capacity? Then you could do that with that data because you can natively access that data in the cloud without going back to the source filer because of the way we keep information. We're preserving the full semantics of the information in the target, the full NTFS permissions, everything is kept intact with the data. Okay, so the architecture itself is scale out, so you can add more observers as you scale. These observers are just virtual machines, and one observer can handle many storage servers, and you can deploy these in multiple sites. These observers talk to a management console that by default runs in the cloud. And as I mentioned before, the data that's moved can directly be accessed in the cloud as well. And you can access it as files in the cloud by spinning up an observer in the cloud, or you can access that data directly as objects in the cloud without Komprise in the picture. So the other thing that we hear a lot from customers is they don't want to be locked in. They don't want to be locked into any storage. You also don't want to be locked into Komprise. And the way we're doing things, there is no lock-in. You can turn Komprise off at any time, and all your data is sitting on your storage. All the metadata is kept with your data. Everything is intact, and Komprise it can be in or out of the picture.
Yeah.
Was that an important consideration for you?
Exit strategies and cloud providers or cloud facilitators are always very important to every IT shop, so that was definitely a consideration. I think the other important thing is that as our data set grows and the data movement volume grows, we can grow the data movers along with it to scale, or we can even shrink them down.
Yep.
And this meant we didn't have to buy an expensive hardware appliance, we didn't have proprietary hardware. So being software defined, having an exit strategy, and being scale out were all very critical to us as our data and business changed.
That's a very interesting point, Carl, because in most environments, there's a lot of cold data sitting there. So initially, you may actually have more observers because you want to move a lot of data fast. And once you hit steady state, you can actually reduce the number of observers in the environment. So you could grow and shrink that on demand.
Agree, totally agree. It's very important.
Yeah. So the last point I wanted to mention before we open this up for questions is also on the pricing side, the other thing we heard a lot from customers is a lot of the legacy solutions are just too expensive, that their cost outweighs the benefit. And the way Komprise is priced, and here we're showing you a perpetual license cost for Komprise, meaning that you buy the license outright. Depending on your environment, you could either go with this model or buy an annual subscription. But we're showing you the example ROI, and your mileage may vary, but typical storage costs on the left-hand side for the data, and then if you did leverage cloud storage along with Komprise, what your costs would be, after you move the data with Komprise, and you can see that the savings can be pretty substantial. So with that, Carl, I don't know if you would like to just recap for us.
Yeah, so thank you, Krishna. It was an excellent demo and overview. Just to summarize the Cadence choice to use Komprise, again, most important for us were to control storage costs as the storage requirements grew. We needed better reporting and visibility. We needed to quickly implement the solution so that we start realizing our investment. And lastly, we could not, under any circumstances, stop the production of software or the support of our customers while we were doing all this activity. So the features and things that Krishna described earlier, the scale out, the software defined, the ability to have a dynamic pointer to the data, an exit strategy, All of these were very key factors and very unique factors in us making our decision, and we're very happy with the decision.
Thank you so much, Carl. We do want to open it up to questions now. Of course, if you want to try Komprise in your own environment, you can sign up at the link that we have shown here, and you can see how much you can save in your environment using Komprise. So we're now just going to start looking at the questions. Okay, so there were some questions, I guess, about the audio. Thanks for bringing that up. That was helpful. So some of the other questions are, does Komprise data require administrator permission to the array file shares to manage data between sources and targets? And that's a great question. I can answer that. When you point Komprise at your storage, Komprise acts as an NFS or SMB client to your storage. And so for Komprise to read data on your storage, it needs to have read permissions to the filers. And when you start moving data, it also needs write permissions. So typically, the permissions you would give Komprise are similar to what you would give a backup application. So you would just add Komprise to a backup operator group, which would give it read-write permissions. If you want Komprise to automatically discover the shares on your filer, you could give those permissions at the root level, and then it allows Komprise to also discover shares. But you can choose to what level you want to give those permissions. I think there were a few other questions. Monica, did you see?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions coming in. So I think this question is actually for you, Carl. So, as you're thinking about your company strategy, what actually led you to think about doing a cloud initiative with the data management?
Sure. So thanks, Monica. So Cadence overall has a cloud strategy around putting business applications into the cloud using typically SaaS. On the engineering side, it's to leverage cloud technologies to develop software and support our customers. And then on the IT side, sort of the internal side, we had to look at ways of optimizing our investments in IT hardware. And as I mentioned earlier, we had flat storage budgets, we had increasing needs, and to us this was a natural extension of our cloud strategy to look at the storage piece and holistically across our data centers. So this fits very nicely into our overall Cadence cloud strategy, and we felt it was complementary.
Okay. So actually we have another question I think might tie onto what you just mentioned about flat budget. So I think that, there's a lot of challenges out there around flat budgets. So how did you actually assess the value of Komprise?
Yeah, so I think the slide that Krishna displayed earlier probably is the key. So we looked at our fully burdened cost on premise. We looked at our budget forecast for that cost, and we said if we could take that cost and reduce it by a factor, whatever that factor is, we could stretch the same dollar that we had budgeted. So we just simply said if we have $10 to spend, we could buy more storage for that $10 using Komprise than without it. And that's how we manage flat budgets and growing storage needs.
Okay, great.
I see there's another question here. The question is, would be interested to know how the solution can be applied to a cloud environment with no direct access to the storage shares if your infrastructure is in AWS or Azure clouds. So I'm not sure if the person asking this question, if they do have on-premise storage that they're trying to move data from, or if all the data is already in the cloud and you're trying to move from one cloud to another. In either case, I could answer actually both scenarios. If you have on-premise storage, but you want to run the Komprise observers in the cloud, you could do that. It just is a latency issue of how much latency there is to your on-premise storage. You would need access to the storage, of course, for us to read and write from it. If you have data in the cloud, for example, Azure Cloud, Azure does provide file access to that data, so it depends on where you have the data. But as long as the source has NFS or SMB6 access to it, we actually don't care what the underlying storage is. The underlying storage could be true NAS, it could be a direct attached storage, it could be block storage, it could be cloud. We are just going through the standard protocols, and we work with NFS, SMB6, and REST S3 protocols. And the other thing I should point out is that the storage that you move data from and the storage you move data to is fully configurable by you. So even though we showed some cloud targets in this demo, the place you move data to does not have to be in the cloud. It could actually be on-premise in a cheaper NAS or object storage, or even tape with an object front end like Spectral Logic. So it could be any of those options. And we support almost all the major storage players.
Okay, great. Let's look at these questions here. So we have one really good question here. So you mentioned stubs in the presentation. What do you mean when you say you do not use stubs?
Right. So the as I mentioned before, stub itself is not so much the issue. A stub file is literally a pointer to the new location of the file. The real issue that stubs had were twofold. One, actually, there were two big issues. One is they were static, and so if they were deleted, then your data could get orphaned. The other issue with stubs and the way systems often handled it is they would cause a full recall of data. And actually, this is an important point because when you move data to the cloud, if every time you open the data is brought back from the cloud may end up being more expensive for you than on-premise storage. The reason for that is the way cloud solutions are priced. The storage itself is cheap, but the data transfer out costs are pretty high. So when you move data to the cloud, it's really important that you have some intelligent controls on how much data is brought back and whether data needs to be brought back or not. And Komprise actually provides you those controls. You can set recall policies in Komprise on whether data is brought back, or whether it's brought back after it gets hot in a certain time period, or it's just left in the cloud. And you can also throttle, just as you can throttle other things in Komprise, you can throttle how much data is retrieved every month from the cloud, so that you can control your network costs, in terms of data transfer out from the cloud.
Yeah, Krishna, just to add, I think that's an important thing to consider. When you're in your data center on-premise, as you mentioned, you can move between technologies. Data transfer is not a factor. But when you go to an external cloud provider, you have to set your policies such that you want the minimum amount of data retrieval from the cloud. So you want to put things old as possible and only get younger as necessary. So I think this is potentially a strategy for anyone to consider who's going into the cloud from on-premise.
Yeah. There was one other question. The question was, how does Komprise work with things like HIPAA and PCI and other data compliance environments? And that's a great question as well, especially because there's a lot of our customers are in the genomics and healthcare vertical, where there is a lot of kind of compliance needed around the data. So there are two things Komprise does to help you with compliance. The first thing to remember is Komprise is not storage. We are actually not storing any data. We're literally just, we're completely transient. We're analyzing and we're moving data, but the data itself is being stored on storage of your choice. So in HIPAA environments, you would set your targets to be HIPAA compliant targets, whether it's a HIPAA compliant storage bucket in the cloud or on-premise, and so the data would be stored in those environments. Komprise does provide you encryption options when you move data. We support encryption at rest as well as encryption at source. So encryption at rest would mean Komprise moves data via SSL, and then your storage provider at the other end is storing the data encrypted, and Komprise works with that. Or if you need tighter encryption, you can actually encrypt data through Komprise using AES 256 encryption with your own master keys, and then we will move encrypted data. So that's how we work in regulated environments. The third thing we do is you can actually segment what is PII and other kinds of data and move that elsewhere from other data. So you can actually filter and set different policies for different kinds of data and exclude certain data from being moved to non-HIPAA compliant locations.
Yeah, and Krishna, just add a finer point. I think the strength of the Komprise solution is that because it is software, you can place it specifically in the regulated environment and have it follow all the same rules that that environment would follow and be specific to that environment, or even be outside of the environment and make sure that you follow the rules to get data in and out. So I think that speaks to the flexibility of the solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Excellent. I think we have run out of questions at this point. I know there's a couple more that said they want to try the product and to get a better understanding. That's perfect. Please feel free to reach out to us if you want to try the solution in your environment, or if you want to get a deeper dive into anything. We really appreciate your time this morning. This session is being recorded, and we will send out a link to the recording. So if you want to share this with colleagues and friends, we would appreciate that. We want to thank Carl very much for sparing his time today and for the valuable input and feedback he gave. Thank you so much, Carl, for joining us today.
You're very welcome, and thank you everyone for attending and spending your valuable time with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, and this concludes our webinar for today.